No one expected the music to stop. Not in the middle of an Elvis Presley concert. Not in front of more than 20,000 people. And certainly not because of a little girl wrapped in a faded blue blanket, clutching an old teddy bear as though it were the last piece of someone she refused to lose. Years later, people would remember every second of that night. Not because Elvis sang his greatest songs, but because, for the first time in anyone's memory, Elvis Presley stood in front of a microphone, opened his mouth, and could not find a single word. The story began on a warm evening in the autumn of 1973. Hours before sunset, fans were already filling every street surrounding the arena. Cars stretched for blocks. Families waited patiently behind metal barriers. Teenagers held handmade signs decorated with glittering letters spelling only one name: Elvis. Some had traveled across several states just to see him once. Some had spent months saving enough money for a single ticket. Some were attending their very first concert. Others believed it might be their last. Inside the arena, the excitement was almost impossible to describe. Every seat was filled. The balconies overflowed with cheering fans. Camera flashes sparkled like stars across the darkness. People laughed, embraced one another, and shared stories about the first time they had heard an Elvis record. To many, he was more than a singer. His voice had accompanied weddings, long road trips, military deployments, reunions, funerals. His songs had become part of people's lives. Backstage, however, everything felt strangely quiet. The familiar noise of stagehands moving equipment echoed through the narrow corridors. Technicians checked microphones one final time. Members of the orchestra carefully tuned their instruments. A stage manager counted the remaining minutes until showtime. Elvis stood alone near a mirror. He adjusted the collar of his white stage suit, its intricate embroidery shimmering beneath the dressing room lights. The rhinestones reflected tiny flashes of color every time he moved. Normally, he would be smiling before a show. Tonight, something felt different. His longtime pianist noticed immediately. "You've been quiet all evening." Elvis looked toward the closed curtain. "Have you ever wondered why people really come here?" The pianist smiled. "They come because they love your music." Elvis slowly shook his head. "I don't think it's only the music." He paused. "I think they bring someone with them." The pianist frowned. "What do you mean?" "A memory." Elvis looked down at his hands. "A mother. A father. A first love. Someone they wish could still be sitting beside them." Neither man spoke again. A knock interrupted the silence. "5 minutes, Elvis." He nodded. As the door closed, he took one deep breath. No matter how many concerts he had performed, the feeling never disappeared. The responsibility, the expectation, the understanding that, for someone in that audience, this night might become the memory they would carry for the rest of their life. The house lights slowly dimmed. The roar from the crowd grew louder, then louder still, until it became almost deafening. The announcer's voice echoed through the arena. "Ladies and gentlemen!" The audience erupted before another word could be spoken. "Please welcome!" The applause became thunder. "Elvis Presley!" The curtain opened. A single spotlight found him. Dressed in brilliant white, Elvis walked calmly toward center stage. Thousands of voices merged into one. Some people cried the moment they saw him. Others screamed his name over and over. He smiled warmly, raised one hand, and almost magically, the arena fell silent. "Good evening," His familiar southern drawl drifted gently through the speakers. What a beautiful crowd. Cheers exploded again. The orchestra began the opening number. Strings swelled, brass answered. The piano entered with graceful confidence. Then Elvis sang. Every note seemed effortless. Every lyric filled the enormous arena with warmth. People stood from their seats, couples danced between the aisles. Children climbed onto their parents' shoulders just to catch a better glimpse of the stage. Song after song, the atmosphere grew more electric. The audience sang along to every chorus, laughed at Elvis's stories between performances, applauded until their hands hurt. For nearly an hour, the concert unfolded perfectly, exactly as rehearsed, exactly as expected. Then came the next song, one of the most beloved of the entire evening. The orchestra prepared, the conductor lifted his baton, the pianist rested his fingers on the keys. The first gentle chord floated through the arena. Elvis stepped toward the microphone. He drew a slow breath. Then, his eyes drifted toward the front row. At first, he almost looked away. Then he froze. Among thousands of cheering faces sat one little girl who wasn't clapping. She wasn't waving. She wasn't calling his name. She simply looked at him. Resting across her shoulders was a faded blue blanket that had clearly been mended more than once. In her arms, she held an old teddy bear whose stitched ear was beginning to unravel. The bear looked loved, very loved. Everyone around her was standing. She remained seated, smiling, quietly, peacefully, almost as if she had been waiting for this exact moment her entire life. Elvis forgot the next lyric, only for a heartbeat, then another. The orchestra continued without him. The conductor glanced over in confusion. A violinist looked up. The pianist hesitated. The music slowly lost its shape. One instrument stopped, then another. Within seconds, the entire orchestra fell silent. More than 20,000 people stared at the stage. No one understood what had happened. Elvis never took his eyes off the little girl. There was something about her smile. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't admiration. It looked like hope, mixed with sorrow. A look no child should ever have to wear. Without saying a word, Elvis lowered the microphone. He stepped away from center stage. The audience watched in complete confusion as he walked toward the edge of the platform. Security instinctively moved forward. His manager whispered urgently through a headset. Elvis ignored them all. He climbed down the steps and slowly made his way through the front aisle. Every footstep echoed inside the silent arena. When he finally stopped in front of the little girl, she looked up at him with the same gentle smile. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Elvis knelt until they were eye to eye. In the softest voice, he asked, "Sweetheart, would you come up on stage with me?" The little girl looked at her mother. Her mother covered her mouth, already crying, and nodded. The little girl placed her tiny hand into Elvis's. Together, they walked toward the stage. No applause followed them. No music welcomed them back. Only silence. The kind of silence that appears when thousands of strangers somehow realize they are about to witness something they will never forget. Elvis kept holding the little girl's hand as they stepped back onto the stage. The arena was so quiet that the sound of their footsteps echoed across the polished wooden floor. No one shouted. No one applauded. Even the photographers lowered their cameras, sensing that whatever was about to happen was far more important than capturing another concert photograph. The orchestra remained perfectly still. The conductor slowly lowered his baton. For the first time that evening, 20,000 people sat in complete silence. Elvis gently pulled a small piano bench closer. "Ready you go, sweetheart." The little girl climbed onto the bench, carefully placing her worn teddy bear beside her. One of its button eyes reflected the bright stage lights. Elvis smiled. "I think he's enjoying the concert, too." A tiny smile appeared on the girl's face. "It was Daddy's." Those 3 words lingered in the air. Elvis looked at the teddy bear again. Suddenly, it wasn't just an old toy anymore. It was a memory, a piece of someone who was no longer there. He knelt beside her. "What is your name?" She softly answered. "And how old are you?" "I'm 7. "Is this your first concert?" She nodded. "My mommy said Daddy wanted this to be my first one." The smile on Elvis's face slowly faded. He glanced toward the front row. Her mother stood there quietly, clutching a handkerchief with trembling fingers. Their eyes met for only a second. She gave him the smallest nod. It wasn't excitement. It was gratitude, mixed with unbearable sadness. Elvis looked back at the little girl. "Would you like to say hello to everyone?" She looked out across the arena. The endless rows of people frightened her. She shook her head. "I don't know if I can." Elvis leaned closer. "You don't have to be loud." He gently handed her the microphone. "You only have to speak from your heart." She wrapped both hands around it. The microphone looked enormous in her tiny fingers. She took a deep breath, looked toward the audience, then looked back at Elvis. Her lips trembled. For several seconds, nothing happened. The silence grew heavier. Somewhere in the upper balcony, someone quietly began to cry without even knowing why. The little girl closed her eyes. Then she whispered, "My daddy dreamed of hearing you before he died." The words barely rose above a whisper, yet they struck the arena harder than thunder. No one moved. The orchestra froze. Every musician stared at the little girl. Elvis didn't blink. His eyes remained fixed on her face. The microphone slowly slipped from her shaking hands. He caught it before it touched the floor. The little girl lowered her head. "I promised him," she whispered. "I'd come anyway." Elvis swallowed hard. His throat suddenly felt too tight to speak. For years, people had told him his songs had changed their lives. They had thanked him after concerts, written thousands of letters, sent gifts, flowers, photographs, but nothing had ever reached his heart quite like those words. He slowly crouched beside her again. "What was your daddy's name?" She answered quietly. Elvis repeated the name with respect, committing it to memory. "He loved your records." The little girl smiled through tears. "Every Sunday." "He played them while making pancakes." A few people in the audience laughed softly through their tears. "He couldn't dance," she continued, "but he always tried." Another gentle wave of emotion spread across the arena. "He said, your music made our house feel happy." Elvis lowered his eyes. He remembered his own childhood. He remembered listening to gospel music with his family. He remembered what it felt like when music filled an ordinary room with extraordinary love. Perhaps music had never really belonged to the singers. Perhaps it had always belonged to the families who carried it home. The little girl carefully reached into the pocket of her blue blanket. She searched for several moments before pulling out a small, worn photograph. Its edges were soft from years of being touched. She held it out toward Elvis. "I brought this." He accepted it carefully. The photograph showed a smiling father carrying his daughter on his shoulders. The very same teddy bear rested in the little girl's arms. Behind them stood a small white house decorated with Christmas lights. They looked unbelievably happy. Elvis smiled. Then he slowly turned the picture over. His smile disappeared. Written in faded blue ink were uneven words. The handwriting was weak, as though written by someone whose strength had nearly faded. "One day, I'll take my little girl to hear Elvis sing." Nothing else. No date, no signature. Just a promise. A father's promise. One he never had the chance to keep. Elvis stared at those words. His fingers tightened slightly around the photograph. He could almost imagine the man writing them, perhaps sitting beside a hospital window, perhaps believing he still had time, perhaps smiling despite the pain because hope is often strongest when people have the least reason to hold on. Elvis slowly looked toward the girl's mother. She stepped onto the stage. The audience instinctively made room. When she reached them, tears were already streaming down her face. "My husband," she whispered, "was diagnosed 2 years ago." Her voice shook. "He spent every treatment listening to your albums." She smiled sadly. "When the doctors asked what he wanted to do after he recovered," she looked at her daughter, "he always gave the same answer." She paused, trying to steady herself. "I'm taking my little girl to see Elvis." Her voice broke. "But—" She couldn't continue. She didn't need to. Everyone understood. The little girl quietly slipped her hand into her mother's. "He told me," she whispered, "that promises don't disappear." Elvis closed his eyes. A single tear escaped before he could stop it. When he opened them again, the arena looked different. He no longer saw thousands of fans. He saw thousands of sons, thousands of daughters, thousands of mothers, thousands of fathers. Every one of them carrying memories no one else could see. He slowly stood, then turned toward the orchestra. The musicians watched him carefully. No one reached for an instrument. No one wanted to interrupt the moment. Elvis looked at the conductor. The conductor gave a questioning glance. Should they continue? Should they follow the set list? Should they begin the next song? Elvis slowly shook his head. No. His voice echoed softly through the microphone. Not tonight. The audience remained silent. He stepped toward center stage, holding the old photograph in one hand and the little girl's tiny hand in the other. "I've performed this show many times," he paused. "And every night, I thought these songs belonged to me." He looked down at the photograph. I was wrong. Another long silence. "They belong to people like this father." He raised the photograph gently. "They belong to every family that ever found hope in them." His voice cracked. "So tonight, this concert isn't mine anymore." He turned toward the little girl. "It's his." The arena erupted into tears. People embraced strangers sitting beside them. Parents held their children tighter. Even members of the orchestra quietly wiped their eyes. Elvis walked to the grand piano. He placed the photograph carefully on the music stand, where it would remain in front of him. He rested his fingertips on the ivory keys. Then he looked at the little girl. "If it's all right with you," he said gently, "I'd like to finish a promise." The little girl nodded through tears. "I think Daddy would like that." Elvis smiled. Not the smile of a superstar, not the smile of an icon, just the smile of one human being trying to ease another person's pain. He looked toward the orchestra. The conductor slowly raised his baton once more. Every musician lifted an instrument. The first violin breathed in. The pianist lowered trembling fingers onto the keys. The arena held its breath, waiting for the first note of a performance that no one would ever forget. No one applauded. No one dared to interrupt the silence. It felt as though the entire arena had forgotten how to breathe. Elvis rested his fingers on the piano, but for several long moments, he didn't play. His eyes remained fixed on the old photograph standing on the music stand. A smiling father, a little girl sitting proudly on his shoulders, a promise written on the back by a man who believed he still had time. Elvis slowly closed his eyes. He thought about every city he had visited, every stage he had stood upon, every standing ovation, every gold record, every roaring crowd. For years, he had believed his greatest achievement was filling arenas. Tonight, he realized he had been wrong. If music could carry someone's love long after they were gone, then perhaps that was its true purpose. He opened his eyes, looked at the little girl. "This song," he whispered, "is for your father." The conductor gently lowered his baton. A single piano note floated into the darkness, soft, gentle, fragile. Another followed, then another. Soon the strings joined, almost like a quiet prayer. There was no cheering, no shouting, only music. Elvis began to sing. His voice sounded different now. It carried none of the confidence of a superstar. Instead, it carried the tenderness of a son, the compassion of a father, the sorrow of a friend. Every lyric seemed to wrap itself around the little girl like a warm blanket. She sat quietly beside the piano, hugging the old teddy bear against her chest. Sometimes she looked at Elvis. Sometimes she looked at the photograph. Sometimes she simply closed her eyes. Halfway through the song, something remarkable happened. The audience stopped watching the stage. Instead, people began looking at one another. A husband reached for his wife's hand. An elderly woman pressed an old wedding ring against her lips. A young soldier quietly wiped away tears while staring at the floor. Parents lifted their children into their arms. Brothers embraced sisters. Friends leaned against each other without speaking. For those few minutes, the arena no longer felt like a concert hall. It felt like thousands of stories sharing the same heartbeat. When the final verse approached, Elvis stepped away from the microphone. He looked toward the audience. "I think," he said softly, "there's someone missing from this chorus." The crowd listened. "So tonight, I'd like all of you to help me finish it." No instructions were needed. The orchestra continued playing. Elvis sang the first line, then lowered the microphone. More than 20,000 voices answered together. Some sang beautifully. Others struggled through tears. Some could barely whisper. Yet every voice mattered. The sound filled every corner of the arena. It was no longer one singer performing for thousands. It had become thousands of hearts singing for one father. The little girl looked around in amazement. She had never heard anything so beautiful. She smiled through tears. For the first time that evening, she laughed. A small laugh, a real one. Elvis noticed and smiled back. When the final note faded, silence returned once more. Not an empty silence, a peaceful one. Elvis slowly removed the photograph from the piano. He walked back to the little girl. Then, in front of the entire arena, he knelt. Holding the photograph carefully between both hands, he gave it back to her. "You keep this." She accepted it carefully. "But," she whispered, "it's for you." Elvis gently shook his head. "No," he smiled. "It belongs with the person who still tells his story." The little girl hugged the photograph tightly against her heart. Then, without saying a word, she wrapped her arms around Elvis. The embrace lasted only a few seconds, yet no one in the arena ever forgot it. Some moments cannot be measured by time, only by the lives they change. When they finally stepped apart, Elvis quietly leaned closer. "So long as you remember him," he whispered, "part of him will always walk beside you." The little girl nodded. "I know." Then she looked toward the ceiling and smiled. "I think he heard the whole concert." Elvis looked upward too. Maybe he did. The audience rose to its feet, not because anyone asked them to, because it felt impossible to remain seated. The applause began slowly, one pair of hands, then another. Soon, the entire arena thundered with gratitude. The musicians stood. The conductor wiped tears from his face before taking a bow. Even members of the stage crew applauded from behind the curtains. The ovation continued. 1 minute, then another. Still, no one sat down. Elvis never bowed. Instead, he stood quietly beside the little girl, allowing the applause to belong to her father as much as to anyone on the stage. Long after the concert ended, people remained outside the arena. No one seemed eager to leave. Strangers embraced. Families spoke in hushed voices. Many called loved ones before driving home, simply to tell them they loved them. In the days that followed, newspapers across the country covered the unforgettable evening. They wrote about the unexpected pause in the concert, about the little girl, about the photograph, about the promise. Yet readers remembered something deeper than the headlines. They remembered that, for one extraordinary night, music became an act of kindness. Years passed. The little girl grew up. The faded blue blanket was carefully folded away. The old teddy bear became worn with age. The photograph gained a few more creases around its edges. But none of those things were ever thrown away. They became treasured reminders that love could outlive loss. As an adult, she devoted herself to music, not because she dreamed of fame, but because she wanted others to feel what she had felt on that unforgettable night. Eventually, she stepped onto a stage of her own, not as a frightened child, but as a gifted pianist. Before her first major performance, she placed the same faded photograph on top of the piano. The audience watched curiously. She smiled. "When I was a little girl," she began, "I thought I was coming to hear a famous singer." She gently touched the photograph. "But that night, I discovered something far greater." She paused. "I learned that the greatest performers are remembered not only for the songs they sing, but for the hearts they choose to hear." The hall became silent. My father once dreamed of bringing me to a concert. She smiled through grateful tears. He couldn't finish that promise. She looked at the photograph one last time. But kindness did. She sat at the piano, placed her hands on the keys, and played. Not for applause, not for recognition, not for success, but for a father whose promise never truly ended, because love has a strange way of finishing the stories that life leaves unfinished. And somewhere, beyond the lights, beyond the music, beyond the tears, a promise finally found its last note.